By early 1942, British military planners were considering ways to strike Germany in ways other than conventional bombing. They faced strong defences and difficult weather conditions over Europe. One plan involved using biological weapons to disrupt food supplies. The project became known as Operation Vegetarian. The idea was simple in concept but complicated in execution. Scientists and military officers designed small cakes made of animal feed. These cakes were infected with anthrax spores, a deadly bacteria that could infect cattle and sheep. The goal was to drop the infected cakes over German pastures. Farm animals would eat the cakes, become sick and die. The resulting disruption could reduce food availability for both livestock and civilians. British intelligence believed that targeting food supplies could weaken morale and force Germany to divert resources from the front lines. The project required careful planning to avoid accidental infection of British animals. Scientists worked in secure laboratories wearing protective clothing to handle the dangerous anthrax spores. They studied how the spores would survive exposure to air, sunlight, and rain. The design of the cattle cakes had to ensure that the spores remained infectious after being dropped from airplanes. Military engineers developed delivery methods for the bombs. Aircraft would carry crates of the infected cakes to target regions. Bombs were modified to release the cakes without destroying them. Timing was critical to ensure the cakes landed on pastures and were eaten by livestock. The plan required coordination between scientists, pilots, and intelligence officers. They mapped German farmland, identifying regions with high numbers of cattle, sheep, and other livestock. Targets were chosen to maximize impact and to avoid areas already affected by Allied bombing. Experts estimated that a successful drop could kill tens of thousands of animals. The plan also considered potential secondary effects on humans. Infection could spread if civilians handled contaminated meat, but British planners calculated that careful timing and targeting could limit direct human casualties. Operation Vegetarian remained secret and highly classified. Only a small number of officers and scientists were aware of the full details. The project involved months of research, experimentation, and logistical preparation. Scientists tested the anthrax spores in controlled settings to observe infection rates in animals. They studied how long the spores could survive in different environmental conditions. Military officers practiced loading and releasing the cakes from aircraft. Flight paths, release altitudes, and dispersal patterns were carefully calculated. The project was complex and dangerous, but British planners believed it could have a major impact if executed. Operation Vegetarian was never used in practice. Concerns about international law, moral consequences, and potential blowback prevented deployment. Despite never being executed, the plan demonstrated the extent of creative thinking during total war. It combined science, military strategy, and psychological planning in a way rarely attempted before. British scientists began full-scale preparation for Operation Vegetarian in the early years of the war. They worked inside secure buildings where strict safety rules were followed at all times. Anthrax spores were extremely dangerous, and even a small mistake could cause infection. Protective suits, gloves, and masks were worn by every worker who handled the spores. The first task was to create the cattle cakes themselves. Small square blocks of animal feed were shaped, mixed, and pressed together. Each block was designed to look harmless, so animals would eat it without hesitation. Once the blocks were formed, scientists added measured amounts of anthrax spores. The spores had to be mixed in a way that kept them stable during storage and transport. Testing began on isolated pieces of farmland far from towns. Scientists placed infected cakes in fenced fields to study how quickly animals discovered them. These tests helped determine ideal sizes and shapes of the cakes. Cattle and sheep usually ate the cakes within a short time after noticing them. The next challenge was durability. The cakes needed to survive long flights, harsh winds, and sudden impacts with the ground. Researchers dropped test blocks from low-flying planes to see if they broke apart. Many early versions failed. They shattered on impact, leaving spores scattered in random patterns that could not be controlled. Engineers returned to their laboratories to strengthen the material. A new mixture was created that held its shape even after falling from great height. This new version passed several drop tests. Attention then shifted to how the cakes would be released from the planes. Special canisters were designed to hold hundreds of blocks at a time. The canisters opened in mid-air, allowing the cakes to spread over large areas. Flight crews practiced using these canisters over open water during training runs. Pilots learned how fast they needed to fly and how high they needed to release the load. Observers on the ground recorded where the blocks landed. Every test helped refine the release pattern. Weather conditions were also studied. Strong winds, heavy rain, or thick clouds could push the cakes off course. Scientists measured how anthrax spores reacted to sunlight, moisture, and temperature changes. They discovered that the spores could survive for long periods in soil. This made them extremely effective but also extremely dangerous. The British government understood the risk. If the wind shifted at the wrong moment, the spores could drift toward nearby communities. Because of this, planners created strict rules for possible missions. Only days with ideal weather would be approved. Only regions with open farmland and few nearby towns would be chosen. Another concern was safety for the flight crews. If any infected cakes were damaged inside the aircraft, the crew could be exposed. To prevent this, every cake was sealed before loading. Workers wore full protective clothing when moving crates into the planes. Each crate was locked shut until moments before takeoff. Medical teams remained near the airfields during all training operations. They were prepared to treat any accidental exposure. No accidents were reported during the testing phase. This success encouraged planners to continue refining the idea. By the end of testing, the project had become complex but fully workable. The cakes were strong enough. The planes could deliver them. The spores remained deadly for long periods, even in tough outdoor conditions. For British planners, it seemed that Operation Vegetarian was almost ready for use. But decisions about deployment were not simple. A single wrong choice could lead to disaster. By late 1943, British leaders had to decide whether Operation Vegetarian should move forward or remain unused. The plan was now technically possible. Tests had shown that the infected cattle cakes could survive a drop from aircraft and remain dangerous. Animals that ate the cakes would become sick with anthrax and die quickly. This gave the operation the power to cripple livestock across wide regions of Germany. But the idea of using a deadly biological agent raised serious questions. Some military officers believed that the operation could shorten the war. They argued that reducing Germany's food supply would weaken the enemy and reduce support for the Nazi regime. They believed that damaging cattle herds and sheep farms could pressure German leaders to surrender sooner. Other officials felt uneasy about the plan. They warned that once anthrax entered the environment, it could remain active for many years. Soil could stay infected long after the war had ended. This raised fears that farmland would become dangerous even when peace returned. The long-lasting nature of anthrax made the operation feel different from traditional bombing or blockades. British leaders also worried about what might happen if Germany discovered the source of the attack. There was a real possibility of retaliation using biological weapons of their own. Germany had access to scientific knowledge and industrial capacity. If Britain used anthrax, then Germany might respond with its own deadly agent against British cities or farms. This risk was impossible to ignore. Some advisors warned that Operation Vegetarian could start a new and uncontrolled form of warfare. The moral question was equally difficult. The plan targeted animals, but it could also affect civilians who handled contaminated meat or lived near infected land. The British government had to consider the human cost. Disease could spread in unexpected ways, especially during wartime, when food shortages forced people to take risks. There was also uncertainty about weather and wind patterns. If the wind shifted during the drop, the infected cakes might drift toward neutral countries, or even blow back toward Allied territory. No one could fully guarantee safety. Scientists explained that spores could travel far through the air and settle in places far from the intended target. This added another layer of danger to the operation. Even controlled tests showed how easily anthrax could escape its intended boundaries. The discussions inside the War Cabinet were serious and cautious. Leaders studied reports from scientists, military officers, and intelligence analysts. Some believed that using anthrax would break a moral boundary that should not be crossed. Others believed that extreme measures were acceptable during total war. The debate continued for months. Each new report added weight to the decision. Those who opposed the plan reminded everyone that biological weapons could shape the future long after the conflict ended. Those who supported the plan focused on the possibility of weakening Germany's war machine. British leaders also considered how the world might react after the war. Using anthrax could change how other nations viewed Britain. There was fear that allies and future partners would question such a choice. International reputation mattered, especially for a nation hoping to help rebuild Europe after victory. These concerns slowly pushed the discussion toward caution. The risks were too great, the long-term damage too uncertain, and so by early 1944 the operation was placed on hold. This was an important turning point. The plan was still ready for use, but the moral and strategic doubts grew stronger than the potential advantages. Operation Vegetarian moved closer to being abandoned. By late 1943, the British government had a complete plan for Operation Vegetarian. They had tested the cattle cakes, they had prepared aircraft for delivery, they had mapped German farmlands in detail. On paper, the plan was ready to use. But leaders now faced a difficult decision. They needed to decide if they should release a deadly biological weapon during the war. British officials understood that anthrax was not a normal weapon. It caused long-lasting contamination of soil. It could remain in the ground for many years. It could infect animals long after the war was over. The long-term danger created serious concern among scientists, and military officers. If the operation was carried out, Germany would lose huge numbers of cattle and sheep. Food shortages would grow worse. There was also a chance that some infection could reach civilians. Leaders asked if this was acceptable during war. They considered the moral cost and the political risk. They also worried about retaliation. If Britain used a biological weapon, then Germany might try to do the same. There was fear that German scientists could create their own deadly agents. They might target British food supplies or even British cities. No one could be certain how far Germany would go in response. Another major concern was control. Once anthrax contaminated the land, it could not be easily removed. British leaders understood that any region hit by this weapon would remain dangerous for many years. This meant farms could not be used even after peace returned. This raised questions about responsibility for rebuilding and cleanup. British scientists warned that some infected animals might carry the disease into other regions. This could cause spread beyond what planners expected. As these risks became clear, the operation grew more uncertain. Churchill and his advisors reviewed the full reports from military and scientific teams. They debated the effectiveness of the plan. They debated the danger to civilians. They debated the risk of retaliation. Each meeting revealed new problems. Each new report showed another reason for caution. The plan was efficient, but it was extremely destructive, and it might remain destructive long after the war ended. By early 1944, the British government decided to halt the operation. They chose to keep the anthrax cakes stored but unused. They chose not to carry out the attack. The final decision was based on the belief that the danger was too great. Operation Vegetarian was never activated during the war. It remained a secret project that came very close to being used. The cancelled operation showed how far nations were willing to plan during total war. It also showed that some weapons created threats that could not be controlled. The decision to stop the operation became one of the most important choices in the history of biological warfare. It was a moment when military power was limited by human caution and fear of long-term damage. This choice prevented anthrax from entering the battlefields of Europe, but the research and plans remained stored for many years, and they continued to influence how nations thought about biological weapons in the future. Operation Vegetarian was never carried out. The infected cattle cakes were never dropped over German pastures. British leaders decided the risks of accidental infection were too great. They understood that friendly livestock could be contaminated. Civilian populations might also be exposed if the plan failed. International law and ethical concerns reinforced the decision. Despite being unexecuted, the project had significant effects on military planning. It demonstrated that biological weapons could be used to disrupt food supplies. Scientists learned how pathogens could survive transport and environmental conditions. They studied methods of delivery, timing, and contamination carefully. The project required coordination between scientists, engineers, and military personnel. It showed the complexity of combining scientific knowledge with operational planning. Even without execution, the planning process informed future military strategies. Civil defense planners gained insight into the potential dangers of biological attacks. They understood the need to monitor livestock, secure food supplies, and control disease outbreaks. Operation Vegetarian became a reference point for studying the possibilities and limitations of biological warfare. Historians note the project as one of the most unusual planned attacks of the Second World War. It illustrated both ingenuity and restraint. Leaders recognized that the destructive potential of the plan could backfire if safety measures were not perfect. The ethical considerations outweighed possible military gains. The project highlighted the tension between scientific possibility and human responsibility. It forced military planners to confront moral questions about harming animals and civilians indirectly. The detailed testing and preparation provided valuable knowledge. Scientists learned how bacteria behaved in feed, how animals consumed contaminated food, and how long spores remained active. These lessons influenced later research in disease control and biological safety. The project also revealed the limits of long-range attacks using unconventional methods. Weather, logistics, and human error all created potential for failure. British engineers developed safety protocols for handling dangerous pathogens that became models for later research. Even though the plan was never executed, it had a psychological effect within military circles. Planners had to consider unconventional attacks from enemies and allies alike. Operation Vegetarian became a historical example of extreme wartime innovation and planning. It remains a subject of study for military historians, ethicists, and scientists. The project showed how careful analysis, testing, and restraint could prevent unnecessary disaster. The story of Operation Vegetarian teaches lessons about war science and the importance of moral decision-making. It demonstrates that even when technology makes an action possible, leadership must weigh consequences and responsibility. Documents, laboratory results, and planning papers preserve the legacy of the project. They provide insight into how a nation prepared for a type of warfare that was never used but could have had devastating consequences. The plan ended quietly with the war, leaving no physical destruction but a lasting understanding of biological risk, military innovation, and ethical restraint.